Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Ed Podcast. I'm your host, Kamar DJ Arnett. I'm flying solo today. We got a great guest with us, Dr. Jesse Mason. How are you, my friend? Thanks for joining.
I'm doing well, just trying to stay warm in this cold.
I bet. Listen, we're happy to have you. I'd love to maybe get started by just introducing yourself to our audience and giving them your origin story, right? How'd you get here? How'd you become so successful in higher ed?
Well, I don't know if so successful being a Southerner by nature, that humility is important, but
Absolutely.
I can tell you that, a native of Georgia,
Sure.
currently serving as Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for the Minnesota State Colleges and University system, overseeing 33 state colleges and universities, 2 year and
Wow.
4 year, um, in Minnesota state,
Right.
alongside, of course, the privates and the University of Minnesota, which has their own system that's different from Minnesota State.
Sure.
Um, but I got into this because I fell in love with teaching and academics early in college,
Sure.
um, in psychology. Even though I wasn't going to go into teaching, I was TAing, but I was like, I don't know, I'd rather go work for a pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
My specialty is psychopharmacology.
Okay.
Um, my training in pharmaconeuroimmunology. Of course, drug addiction is what really got me into it and how it was impacting the communities that I grew up, particularly in, and got the opportunity to come to grad school. Worked a little while as a postdoc at the U of M Medical School while teaching as associate professor at a 4 year, and had to make a decision around, did I really want to do the research mostly pathway, or do I want to do teaching
Right.
and research? And so I chose teaching and discovered that I really love working in community colleges, impacting people from a broad, diverse of backgrounds, and being able to help them develop and see their aspiration and meet their dreams
Sure.
where they are and open those doors, because I know how transformative education can be. So, briefly, that's my kind of story as a first generation college graduate, actually first generation high school graduate
Wow.
who found that education was has been transformative
Sure.
for me and for the generations that have come after me within my family.
Absolutely. So you kind of talked about kind of falling in love with higher ed and that pivot from pharmaceuticals. When did you first fall in love with leadership in higher ed?
Well, as a faculty member, you can lead a class, you can lead a research lab, but then you begin to kind of notice that there are some things that are unsaid in rooms that you're not.
Right.
And sometimes you don't want to take on that responsibility. But I come from a generation where my responsibility is not my own individual achievement, but the achievement of my community. And how do I give back? And how do I particularly support them? And
Sure.
I found that through my different leadership roles, from being just a chair of a department or a coordinator of a department or leading equity initiatives for retention, that I did have the knack to bring people together, to help move, to be inclusive and create innovative spaces. And that's how I fell in love with leadership, but also fell in love with the challenges and being able to work with some more intelligent people than I am and more people who have more experience than me, to be
Sure.
able to create resolutions that will have an impact on students achieving their dreams.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you kind of talk about that, I know one of the topics that you're really passionate about is system leadership in times of dynamic change. And when you talk about change, I always think it's interesting. They've got a lot of strategy books, 48 Laws of Power, Sun Tzu, Art of War. I mean, you name it, Japanese Book of Five Rings. But it was one I came across. It was this book called The Art of Worldly Wisdom. And this one is really small. It's like this big. like width wise. You can put it in your pocket, in your shirt pocket, right? It's that small, but it's thick. It's about a 300 maxims, right? And I remember when I first read this book, the first maxim was everything is at its peak. And I was like, this is the first maxim? Like, I don't understand it, right? And, as I grew and developed and got older, and, I understood that, wow, like at any given moment in time, everything is at its peak. So when
Yeah.
you talk about dynamic change, I'm like, at this time, things are changing more rapidly than they've ever changed in the history of the universe, right? So being able to understand systematic leadership in those times was a great topic that you suggested. So I love to hear you unpack that one.
Well, in state systems, you
Sure.
have to deal with a lot of dynamic. For example, in Minnesota State, we have over 14,000 employees. As I said, 33 campuses that serve over 54 communities across Minnesota State, and roughly about 270,000 plus students.
Okay.
We're the largest provider of education for dual enrollment, the larger provider for students of diverse backgrounds within the
Sure.
state. And so we have a broad range of technical program, community college programs for transfer, and 7 universities versus 26 community and technical colleges. So when you talk about system change, you're really talking about tailoring change management
Right.
to not only the state and how do we impact the state to continue to be more prosperous and provide opportunities of access and opportunities for students meeting workforce needs, thinking about the different agendas that impact our students and our campuses in the diverse communities that they serve, but also thinking about how those communities are serving. Many of our communities, even in our rural areas, do not look the same they looked 25 years ago when I first got to Minnesota as a graduate
Absolutely.
student. And so, how do we particularly navigate that when things are constantly changing?
Yep.
One of the things that I've had to think about, especially in the last few years and especially this year, the fact of allowing or reinforcing resiliency in leadership, resiliency among the faculty, resiliency among the faculty, but still resiliency among our students who face even more challenges, which require that we have an understanding that we are certainly no longer the White Tower, that we can be isolated from social and political situation as they have been impacting us. And so
Right.
what does that change management necessarily look like? When you look at the history of higher education in the United States, there's been three different, or we're going through our third, I would say, changes from the classics and from limited access to broadening access, especially
Yep.
with the creation of community colleges and state institutions and land grants, um, to where we are now, having more opportunities or having more pressure to align our academic programming with workforce and workforce opportunities that are not here now. But
Right.
how do we support our students and supporting the faculty and the students to engage in different ways now in creating those opportunities and those educational experiences. So when I think about the dynamic changes, how do we reinforce resiliency and flexibility? Humans are naturally adaptive, but we
Yep.
like consistency. And whether we want to be honest with it or not, we don't like change because that
Mm.
change also have what impact on our worldview, in a worldview that we have sustained for 20, 30 years. And now
Yep.
higher ed is being blown up. And we don't know what it's going to look like in a few years. But we know we have to navigate these changes for our students. But I also think if we really stick to the mission of access and opportunity, we can't stray away
Yep.
from serving students. Long as we listen to the populace and the students that we particularly need, it has nothing to do with lowering rigor. It is again creating quality access, which is we know where you are, we're meeting you where you are, we're helping you understand where you want to go, and we're going to support you. And we want you to understand where you can get that help and support. And higher ed still is that place, especially for students like me who grew up in poverty. It is still the most mobile, has the most impact on social mobility than
Right.
any other institution in the United States.
No, absolutely. It's interesting though because there's a kind of a lot of different ways we can go when you talk about the system leadership, the dynamic change. How do you lead, I guess, staff, faculty, leadership within higher ed, which can tend to be a bit rigid, right? As opposed to, being super agile in, a world that's changing so dynamically.
I, I think it start with the discussion and expectation. I'm one
Sure.
of those people. I want to hear what you have to say. What are some of the barriers, and how can we cross those barriers? But
Hmm.
also helping us understand that our outcomes and our goals don't necessarily have to change, but how we do them have to change. Now we got artificial intelligence,
Yep.
which when I was growing up, when I was in school, we didn't have that. We had the encyclopedia. Then, sometime later we could do a search engine, but the information was not as accurate or
Yep.
different things like that. And now we're living in a world where we have all this technology, and a lot of more and more students are taking courses online. This navigation, this change is not new to us,
Nope.
and how technology and social dynamics. There was a particular time when students of diverse, especially those who have been historically marginalized, never thought about college.
Mm.
And now, 20 years ago, we started seeing that for a lot of students, traditionally not thought about college. College was their number one thing after high school. And
Yep.
so you saw an increase in the diversity on our campuses, and we had to create more inclusive and understanding campuses to be able to deal with the changing population and the changing markets to create those opportunities. And so telling those stories, hearing from individuals, especially those who probably push back more, and it's not their fault because we've created this in reference to what sustainability, what is consistent, and what is the culture of higher ed, rather than always, rather than thinking about it. And when I first came into teaching, and when I said thinking about it, when I came into teaching, we, and especially in science, we always expect there's going to be some change or some significant discovery that's going to change everything that we do or how we think. And higher ed hasn't changed in reference to that. We just have to remember from our studies that everything is dynamic and is ever changing, whether we notice it particularly or not. It is how we reinforce and provide skills for people to adapt, but also not only adapt, but in that adaptation, be comfortable with being
Yep.
uncomfortable, because I believe that leads to innovation and serving
Mm.
students. And so the whole idea when working with faculty and staff is being honest, telling your truth, but also listening to them. And how do we bridge this gap in understanding to get where we're going? And so I always go back to our mission and our values, which Minnesota State was an extraordinary education for our students that is accessible, quality, that creates opportunity for workforce development, but in life changes. So the
Yep.
whole student in that scheme, and but those diversity of experience of the faculty and staff is also meaningful because it also reflects the world that we live in. And so we're no ivory tower that is separated from the world of our students. And the last thing I'll say about that, it is also the recognition that our students already come with life experiences that could also have a positive impact on our culture in higher ed from the institution to the system.
Mm. No, those are great points. when you think about faculty, staff, and other leadership members, do you start to have to look for a different profile, or is it just more of an onboarding and training and development to kind of prepare the team and the culture for the dynamic change that is happening now and that's also in front of us?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think, especially in Minnesota State, our presidents do a good job in understanding where we are and where we
Sure.
need to go. Being a professor is not something that, people jump in for 1 or 2 years. Some people may discover I don't like it and go back to corporate or go into corporate.
Yep.
But it's normally for when someone gets tenure, now you're talking about 20, 30 years in a situation. And so the profile changes in what we particularly need. The profile from changing from just having an academic background, but having a passion for teaching, having the
Mm.
passion for student learning, not necessarily about power within
Yep.
the classroom, but having a passion to create interactive learning, learning from students, also being critical of the theoretical principles, but also making it apply. Can we hire someone that has not only the academic experience, but those applied experience that will support our students, but also the sincerity and the authenticity to serve a broad range of students? And so we have to keep that in mind in that profile, but we also have to find a way to what? Continue to support those faculty and those staff to be continue to be invigorated. So how do we as leaders remove those barriers that enable them? And so we have to think about those things, but also the empowering our employees to be able to say what they need. Because if I'm coaching you correctly, your needs and aspiration are just as important
Yep.
as the institution endeavors. So how do I marriage that? How I support that? But also how do I be honest when this is those things may not necessarily complement each other.
Right.
But that's how the
Absolutely.
profile changed. But we also have to sustain those who are employed and have those experiences. You know how it goes in reference to even K-12. Those especially those schools that have more mature experienced teachers normally have better outcomes for the students where rare and we're talking about more suburbs in the rural area we normally have newer teachers who are still learning. Doesn't mean that they're not good at their job.
Right.
It's just a disproportion, and so we have to look at things broadly but also in an eclectic way. How do we meet the faculty and staff where they at their needs and support them?
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's transition a bit because I could feel your passion on that topic. We could probably go on for a couple hours on it. But you've got a couple, more passions when you talk about state partnerships and access and opportunities, prison education and development education reform. How'd you kind of get interested or concerned about that and maybe unpack it a little bit and how has it become a passion for you?
Well, access and opportunity, I didn't have the word for it back in those days when I was growing up in the hood.
Right.
But it was always kind of important to me and strange to me in a way in reference to I have to admit I was seen as the model student.
Okay.
You know, I come from 5 generations of brick masons, and I couldn't lay a brick to my father's disappointment. And so he was like, "You have to go to school. This is not for you. You're going to have to find something else to do." But
Sure.
also, when it came to just having uncles and others who were in and out of whether it's juvenile justice system or just the justice system and hold and how do we kind of change that nature? That's how I got into drug addiction research and wanted to have a positive impact, especially on the needs of those who are impoverished and marginalized. And
Right.
the, the what really brought it home for me, I led a program at Minneapolis College called the African American Education empowerment program. And I noticed more and more that a lot of my students had just transitioned from
Okay.
being incarcerated or from the prison system.
Got
And
you.
navigating with them. So I created a subgroup to support them in how they navigate it and just to see how it changed their lives, that they could now necessarily have aspirations
Mm,
related to education and creating such a sustainable life for their children and for themselves and their families and being able. And I said, sometimes we miss out on opportunities. Someone who's done prison ministry and have worked with individuals who have been in the social justice system and found that they're some of the smartest individuals, but our opportunities were different. Our perception of those opportunities, particularly, were different. And so for me, that experience at Minneapolis College started me to think about how do we create better spaces. And when I got into this position, the governor had already started work on looking at prison education, and the Department of Correction had already started developing a foundation and partnership with us in the University of Minnesota and offering courses to them. And so we've strengthened that relationship with the Department of Correction. They are creating a great infrastructure that we're serving more students. Our institutions are doing a great job in serving those students. We've gone from just serving them and offering courses in the facilities to also creating transitions program like the one at Minneapolis College for those who are transitioning who haven't finished their degree, but also what those colleges will help them do job placement. And as we know, when those students um, get their degrees and they're placed in job, it reduces recidivism
absolutely. Absolutely.
drastically, and it create changes for generations to come. And so
Sure.
that's the kind of access and opportunity that I am talking about when it comes to developmental education reform that we're engaged in. It really has to do with how do we help students recognize their potential rather
Okay.
than coming from a deficit model.
Right.
Thing because honestly, we lose over 60% of our students who have to take those prereq, what we call the lowest developmental course to get into a college course. So that may be 3 semesters.
Right. Right.
A lot of them stop out or drop out before they even take their first college level course. And so our work has really been how do we help them recognize their potential through what we call co-requisite education design. Even though it's not fully implemented, it's being implemented across Minnesota State, and some of our institutions have a longer history with creating those co-requisite. And what we're seeing is they're mostly successful as we're seeing fewer and fewer students are also being assigned to developmental courses as well. And so it's again, it go back to meeting students where they are, trying to find innovative ways to help them not only save money because of cost,
Right.
but how do we reduce time to degree without reducing the quality of the experience that they will have in our institutions?
No, absolutely. It's interesting because one of the reoccurring themes on our podcast has been this enrollment cliff.
Mm,
And some people call it a demographic cliff. So, kind of hearing you talk about it, it's like, okay, you're kind of almost serving, kind of two, wins, so to speak, for lack of a better word, right? You're extending the reach and the access, the opportunity to people that need the development or people that have been incarcerated and changing the trajectory of that person's life and generations in front of them all at the same time when education or higher ed needs to explore that because of once again the dynamic change and what COVID has done to the educational landscape. And then when you add the financial piece to it, because I think we talked about this on the first episode of Everything Higher Ed, and I want to say is it 67% of college students have not completed. Like they just have credits but haven't completed an actual degree. And then you add that to the point where I did a podcast with a great fella named Jeremy Bean. He's a Penn State guy like myself, so of course I'm going to call him great, right? But he was explaining how I think maybe 20 years ago, 20 to 30% of the education expense came from the student and their family, and 70% came from other means. And now it's reversed. 70%, 70 to 80% is coming from the student and their family, and 20 to 30% is coming from their other means. So I mean, it's like you're juggling so many different things, as you try to kind of figure this, thing out. And it seems like you've pinpointed a lot of those characteristics.
Yeah. When we think about it broadly, I know that in higher ed now we're thinking about with this enrollment cliff, we got adult population that need to
Yep.
be retrained or
Yep.
having those transition and those kinds of things. But also I think where we're moving to be able to serve those students, despite an enrollment cliff that says because fewer students are graduating from high school because of population decline,
Yep.
doesn't necessarily mean that our mission changes. It's that it has to broaden and it has to deepen, that we really reflect and serve the communities that we
Sure.
serve. And so when I talk about learners and I say students, I include everyone. Those students who have been working in carpentry or construction, and they want to come into management. How do we make that transition from their life experiences to getting a degree that will allow them to go into whether we talk about project management or any of those kinds of things, the transition, how do we create those pathways? And so it's going to become more about those sustainable pathways and those pathways that don't have to always require a full 4-year degree. How
Sure.
do we create and learn, whether it's through credit for prior learning, recognize that you have a whole life experience of learning. You
Yep.
may not use the terminology we use, but your experiences and what you've learned is important to us to help us navigate to get you to that credential that you need. So when I talk about developmental education, I'm not necessarily just talking about those who are coming out of GED or who've been out of high school for 10 or 12 years, because there's still some learning. But we're also talking about those individuals transitioning from other countries and how do we work with adult basic education and how do we get them into those college courses so they're field prepared and that they are also successful, but also the recognition of what we call micro credentialing and stackable credentialing. If I can get you a micro credential that stacks into the full degree, um, or a certificate that stacks in, but it allows you to go to work because some of our institutions have 70 to 80 students who are part-time because they have to work. And
Sure.
again, this is a new pathways. We have to be, as you stated earlier, agile and um, delivering the educational opportunity, but also delivering of the promise of job placement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's interesting you went down that path. I think when we did the first episode of the Everything Higher Ed podcast last week, I think it was Janelle Elias, and she said, well, she said when you hear the 60 to 70%, have college credits but haven't completed, she said a lot of times your first inclination is to think, oh, that's something terrible. But she said, what if it's not? She said, what if, not saying all of them, but what if there's a percentage of those people that got what they needed in order to be better at a position, get promoted in a position, or get that position? She kind of spoke about how we have to embrace that too. And it's like you said, micro credentials. Is there something that we could present to make them where they have completed something, or just to understand that maybe they got exactly what they needed, we gave them what they needed, and now they're in a better place? And how do we, because everything's still about outcomes, how
Yeah,
do we communicate that to the people that we need to communicate it in so that they understand that no, higher ed is still viable, if
yeah.
that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things, because, a lot of us have to go, if you say outcomes, what we're evaluated on, not
Sure.
only just from accreditation agencies, but the federal government, what we're evaluated on completers,
Right.
on graduation
Yep.
rates, and not necessarily in even our applications
Yep.
for students and admissions. You know more about admissions than I do. We don't we don't ask them, are you just here for a few classes so you can get,
Yep.
get that next role?
Yeah.
We assume that they're here to finish
Yep.
a degree.
Yep.
And the whole idea is, how do we, one, um, with you through micro credentialing or certificate, help them build to that, because they may still have the aspiration of completing that degree.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
And so again, how do we create those pathways that is timely, and also is of quality? And so those are the things that we have to think about in higher ed. But
Sure.
also, we're going to have to think about, how do we assess and change the evaluation process? Because if I know a student is visiting, that's a different thing, because they're visiting. They may take one or two courses and
Yep.
go on back to their home institution or do something else.
Yep. Yep.
But if they need financial aid, they can't be visiting.
Right.
They have to, what? They're
Yep.
required to have
A
some kind
certain
of
low.
major,
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
and so we've already put them in the box that we're
Yep.
being necessarily evaluated for. But also, sometimes I think what we forget is the economic impact that our institutions make. We publish these things, but we don't think about the lives that it changed. I did some research when I was looking at, um, um, when I was a policy fellow, in reference to, what if in the state of Minnesota we got 10,000 more students to graduate high school? And of course, we have some of the worst racial disparities. But if we just got 10,000 more students
Sure.
uh, to graduate high school, and what I found is, that would be 3.1 more million in state investments, as far as investment
Wow.
broadly, for state revenue.
Yep.
It would be up more than 15, $10 million, when we talk about
Wow.
those things. And that's also including saving the state on some of the social programs,
Right.
that
Wow.
it's
Okay.
hard to necessarily support. And so, but that was 10, 15 years ago. But when you think about, if we got them 10,000 more students to graduate high school,
Yep.
and we know that, as you get those credentials and degrees, unemployment rate goes down.
Yep.
So what does that mean? That means more safe communities and supportive community, more revenue, so that we can have better streets and lights and be able to pay for the public safety and everything that we need, more investments in the
Wow.
companies in the state.
Yep.
And sometimes I think we lose out on the true picture of, when we change lives, we make it better for everyone.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I
Absolutely.
think we forget that. We just look at numbers and say, oh, those 60 and 70, but we forget that they may be some of those students that have gone and got promoted, and now they're investing more in the community,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
investing more in the state.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's funny. Buffett always he calls it the snowball effect. And I had a buddy that I went to college, and everybody has their catchphrase. He was like, "It's a domino effect, Kamar. It's a domino effect, right?" But it's like, wow, when you say that, when you sit back and think about it, it's such a positive. Like it's such a positive on so many levels, that it's easy to become passionate about it. And that's the you want to tell everybody, did you realize that if we do this, that, like, because you really think like everybody should be excited about it.
Yeah.
And then how do you start to get people to buy in? Because that's the other thing. It's the connection, right? From high school, it's the higher ed, colleges, universities, technical schools, and then with the colleges, technical schools, it's the employers and kind of those partnerships. And then the more you can get aligned, you can understand that you can have certain courses, that are going to really prepare these people to get what they need, whether they need a couple courses, whether they need the whole degree. And then you get into the dual enrollment and having people that, when they come out of high school, they only got a year before they got their associate degree. So all of those things kind of work to almost push you to where you need to get that you can't screw it up because you're almost already there, but then that takes a village.
Yeah, but and also, but it's also allowing us in higher ed to think more broadly.
Absolutely.
Apprenticeship is not different from what we do.
Yep.
How do we embed it for those individuals who are not classroom setters?
Yep. Yep.
How do we embed that, but also we can still give them a well-rounded education through
Sure.
apprenticeship.
Yep.
We can
Yep.
still give them from work-based learning.
Yep.
And and so those are I think those are the challenges in higher ed. How do we get over this traditional model?
Yeah.
Start thinking about what's best going to support the students and the students from diverse background. We can take out the gender, we can take out the race, and but those things are important. But
Yep.
when we are thoughtful
Sure.
about the individuals that we are serving, we do a better job with racial disparities and gender
Yep.
disparities. When we are thoughtful and respect the experiences, what Yoso call it cultural capital.
I like that.
And I think if we recognize students' cultural capital when they first walk through the door, we will not only be more sustainable as institution, as a system, we'll be more viable to the community and viable to the state and the world.
And listen, I talked about people in their catchphrases. I can't think of a better place to end it than right there. Yours is going to be more viable. I love it. Can you let our audience know where they can reach your LinkedIn, Instagram? Are you working on any novels, anything you want to promote? This is your time.
No, you can just reach me on LinkedIn, Jesse Mason, PhD. I do a little poetry writing, but I'm not at the book stage. And of course, I've been doing research on the dynamics of more, what is it, cross-cultural leadership.
Sure.
Um, in this age, but just looking at those leadership books and looking at some of the areas that may need improvement, because you know I can go down a whole rabbit list on the history of multiculturalism and leadership, but those are some of the things I'm kind of engaged in now, and
Sure.
also just the whole idea of increasing the number of teachers of color that will
Yep.
also have an impact on higher ed and the state viability.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. I appreciate you.